think government regulation is boring.
You'd be right.
But it's still important.
Hey, welcome back to Thinking Out Loud. I'm Joel.
I'm Eric.
Hello from Detroit. Today, we are talking about the really controversial, fascinating, hair-raising topic of FTC, guidelines and regulations as applied to influencers.
It's not that controversial, is it?
I think it can be.
All right. Well,
I think it can be.
What's your take? Like, can you give a 15-second summary of the guidelines for all of our viewers?
If I give a summary, I'm also going to tip my hand in terms of what I think of said guidelines.
I'll give the summary.
So you give the summary in the most objective way possible.
Okay.
And just FYI, if you're really not in the influencer space, if you're not creating content, and if you're not, this isn't going to be all that interesting.
But it applies to brands too. But this is going to be 30,000 foot, and we're not lawyers. This isn't legal advice. This is just our thoughts. Disclaimer. So, speaking of disclaimers, the FTC has this regulation. If I'm going to boil it down to its very simplistic essence, it's any reasonable individual, normal John Q. Public or Jane Q. Public, should walk away from a piece of content and have the impression that it was paid for.
If it was
in fact paid for.
Right.
So that anyone, the theory behind it is that anyone should have knowledge of anything that would bias the way someone might say something. Because these are, quote unquote, influencers that we're talking about.
Right. Okay. So
you think this is wise? Do you think there is infinite wisdom in the FTC's approach to this regulation? Give me that case.
Okay, well, the case is very simple. That look, for something crafted by a body of bureaucrats, I'm actually amazed at how user-friendly, how the regulations treat both creators and brands like humans who are rational, sentient beings capable of more than the baseline of simplistic thought. And yes, to your point, the regulations are set up to say, like, look, if you're getting paid for something, make it clear that you're getting paid for something. And then here's where it really succeeds, because government has a tendency to then need to have all the lawyers and everyone justify their jobs by having this massive document that spells out exactly what that means and how you have to do it. And amazingly, the FTC guidelines do not do that. It gives you broad range of interpretation. It's like, look, just figure out some way to let your audience know that you got paid for saying that you like that product.
Okay.
And I think that is they are a model of regulatory and bureaucratic restraint when it comes to this.
Interesting viewpoint. And I appreciate that viewpoint. I do.
Because it's right.
There is, however, another interpretation.
Yeah.
Which would go something like this. Any vagaries or just kind of loosey-goosey written regulation is the perfect breeding ground for a government or governmental regulative body to abuse power, because they can selectively enforce it, in this case, in their subjective approval or disapproval, or not in this case.
Yeah.
And I think that breeds a lot of confusion. It is a little bit more, I think, prescriptive in certain platforms. Like I don't think it says you have to say ad or hashtag ad or hashtag paid in Instagram, but in the Q&A, in the Q&A on the FTC site, it suggests those two. And it does say it has to be above the fold. in those. That's all like case study that comes through those 90 letters that
Yeah,
the FTC
yeah. Well, it's
sent out.
like for instance, these would be acceptable, but you don't have to say #ad. You don't have to say #sponsored. If you want to be safe, you can do what the recommendation is. But we've also regularly employed like, hey, I partnered with Folgers Coffee to, whatever. And like that, I partnered with this brand to do this is a perfectly valid formula. So I hear that. I would certainly grant that the way that these are written opens up the door to potential abuse. My hope is that these are behavior setting guidelines, that the government will be reasonable in its implementation and execution of these guidelines. And the one thing that actually gives me really, really great confidence that it won't be is they're regulating influencers. And if some bureaucrat gets all high and mighty and wants to enforce something, they're going to piss off a community of millions of people that have billions of followers collectively. And I think there's no administration on any level of government in history that says, no, it is worth it to deal with this backlash from these people in order to enforce this regulation. Okay. And now,
ultimately, I agree with you. And ultimately, my takeaway, and I think both of our takeaway and advice for any CMO or any marketer out there is going to just say, look, be intelligent.
Yep.
Look at the guidelines and err on the safe side of them. You can do it in a way that isn't overly prescriptive and overly rigid, and it's gonna ruin your voice.
Right. Now,
there's a way to do it.
That bleeds into creators who are facing this, where you've got some lawyer from some brand that you're working with.
That's a really good point.
Telling you have to do this, 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 and this. No, take the time to know your rights. Know what you have to do. Know what you don't have to do. Because and this is what we've seen, is that we've seen brands behaving badly, trying to get specific talking points into the text, be it in the show notes or the description,
and pushing around the creator, saying they have to do this and this because that's what they're...
And saying it's a legal requirement when it absolutely is not.
So know your rights.
Yeah, know your rights if you're a creator. Like the FTC guidelines are actually written to be very digestible, very understandable, and it gives you broad discretion in how you go about disclosing the partnership. And the overriding standard, very simply, and Eric laid it out clearly, is that a reasonable person would come away knowing what part was paid for and what endorsement was paid for. And if you've accomplished that, then you're fine. And you do not have to let any brand push you around and say, here's what you have to do. I partnered with brand X, the world's best-selling Y. You don't have to do any of that. You be reasonable, know your rights. Okay, I think we've sufficiently covered this.
We have.
All right. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for stopping by. This has been the FTC and you. So long from Detroit.
Fight the power.
And the man.
See ya.